I am speaking, as I do every week, with State Senator Bruce Tarr. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, good afternoon, Heather.
Good afternoon. And you have been up very late last night, finishing off the budget. Tell us how that went.
You know, usually when we do the state budget, Heather, it's one of the most intense times of the legislative year. And this year, in that respect, it was no different. But a couple of things were different. Number one, we were debating this budget in November, when normally we would be doing that sometime in May on the part of the Senate, because we try to get a budget in place by the beginning of the fiscal year on July 1st. So that was different. A second thing that was different is that almost all of the members were participating in the debate remotely via electronic communication, where they could speak to issues and they could listen to the debate. But there weren't many people at all in the chamber. You might have seen that when the House did its budget debate, there had been some issues with COVID-19 transmission, and we didn't want to repeat that. And so we had a very few number of members in the chamber. And in fact, on the first morning of the debate, which was Tuesday, the folks that were going to be in the chamber were actually tested for COVID-19. And then when we went into the chamber, we stayed very distant from each other. So for instance, my seat is close to the rostrum in the chamber because I'm the minority leader. My seat got moved a little further away. The chairman of Ways and Means seat got moved a little further away. So it was a very, very different environment. And it was also different substantively in that last year we had about 1,150 amendments, might have been 1,149, but in that neighborhood. And this year we had 473 amendments filed. So it was a drastically reduced number of amendments. And I actually think that was a good thing in this case, because from my perspective, we really need to focus on a narrow set of priorities and objectives for this budget to be able to get through this and get the budget in place quickly and really restrict our focus to the tools that we need for the economy and for COVID-19 and for public health and issues of that nature. So it was a very different atmosphere, a very different debate in most respects, but I'm pleased that we were able to resolve the debate, get the budget done, and now we will go to conference committee. We did not appoint one today. I thought that might be the case, but we did not. But conference committee will be 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate that will work out the differences between the 2 versions of the budget. I expect we'll probably do that on Monday because we really want to get to this quickly and get a bill to the governor's desk, because right now we're operating on an interim budget that expires at the end of this month. And we'd really like to get a budget for the remainder of the fiscal year. So between now and next July, we'd really like to get that done before we have to do another interim budget.
So, Bruce, just describe really quickly what it's like to work remotely with the entire Senate. I mean, can you see them on a screen? Can you hear them? What does it even, how does that even work?
So unfortunately, we don't see each other on the screen. So my perspective is one that comes from being in the chamber, and we always try to have at least one member of each party in the chamber to make sure that there are proper checks and balances and we're watching what's happening and monitoring it. So in this debate, for the most part, there was the chairman of Ways and Means, who was Senator Mike Roderick from Westport, who did an incredibly good job of putting together a budget under these circumstances. I was there on behalf of the minority party, and you had someone presiding, which at some times was the Senate President, Karen Spilka, but oftentimes was either Senator Will Brownsberger from Belmont or Senator Cindy Friedman from Arlington. And there were some staff people there. So I had one staff person, Hirak Shah. There were staff people from the president's office to help manage the flow of the debate, and a few people from the Ways and Means Committee staff, and then a few technical people. And that was really it in the chamber. Once in a while, a member would come in and speak in the chamber, but they were only allowed to come and to make their remarks and then leave immediately. And it didn't happen very much. The experience for most senators was one of being on what amounts to a conference line, where they did not necessarily have video, but they had audio connection. They could listen to the debate. They could signal to the Senate president or the presiding officer that they wanted to speak, and then they'd be connected. In the chamber, I could not see video. There was no video. But what would happen is they would be patched through to the sound system in the chamber so they could be heard very well as if they were in the chamber debating. And that was true for the other members. They would also be listening via the conference line to those remarks. So very, very different, and not the kind of telecommunication you and I are having right now. There was no visual component to it. It was an audio component.
Did that feel really significant that you couldn't see each other?
It did, and the reason that it was most significant is something that may not be readily obvious unless you've been intimately involved in the legislative process. And that is, when the amendments get presented, in this case there were 473 of them, they are oftentimes modified significantly and changed in the process. And oftentimes that change occurs because members who are interested in a particular amendment, when they're in the State House, will get together and have a sidebar conversation about how to rewrite an amendment to make it stronger or to get more consensus and more support. When you're not in the State House physically, it makes it very difficult for that to happen. So in this case, there was a lot less redrafting of amendments. Those that watch Senate debate know that I frequently refer to the redraftatron. When someone has changed an amendment, I say it's been run through the redraftatron. What that means more often than not is that a group of members have worked together to rewrite the amendment. That didn't happen nearly as much in this debate, and I think the process is lesser for it. Now, I know why we had to do it this way this year, and I don't disagree with that, but it's always a better legislative process when people can have conversations about particular amendments. So it isn't just you file an amendment and everybody either agrees or disagrees with it, and that's the end of the discussion. It's much better when you file an amendment and some people say, if we changed it in this way or that way, it would be stronger, or I could support it when I otherwise wouldn't support it. That really is a critical part of the process that we didn't have nearly as much of this year. So a couple of the really important parts of this budget, first of all, are level funding for education, for K through 12 education for our school districts. Now, you may recall that last year we had passed the Student Opportunity Act, which would have prescribed significant amounts of increases for every school district in the Commonwealth. But given the pandemic, we can't do that. The good news is we had feared having to make a 10 to 20% cut in Chapter 70 education aid for local school districts. We didn't have to do it. So the budget level funds every school district, and it also makes an adjustment for inflation and enrollment. So the formula that we use for education funding isn't static. It has to change because there's the cost of inflation, and enrollment in each district necessarily changes. It isn't always the same. So in order to make those accommodations, we had to add about $108 million, which we did, to be able to keep pace with inflation, keep pace with enrollment, and level fund, which I think will be welcome news to school districts who were planning to have to make a substantial cut. Similarly, when it comes to local aid, which we now call UGA, unrestricted general government aid, which are the dollars that state government gives to cities and towns that can be used for anything in their budgets, that number was level funded as well. So no cut to education, no cut to local aid, very significant. But a couple of the things that I was concerned about go a little deeper than that. So one of the ways that we also help our local school districts is with the enormous cost of special education. And that has been done for the last several years according to a formula that's known as the circuit breaker formula. And the idea behind that is that when costs for an individual student trigger a circuit breaker, when they reach a certain level, which is 4 times the foundation budget spending for an individual student, then the state picks up a percentage of the rest of that cost. And so to give you an example, last year, and the law actually states that we'll do 75% reimbursement. Last year we did that. We were afraid that we weren't going to get to 75% this year, but we did in this budget.
That's great.
Something else that's also important, it touches really every school district because every school district is pretty much a member of a vocational region. So in our case, Essex North Shore Vocational Technical School, but it's also impactful in regional districts like Manchester, Essex. The law in Massachusetts says that we are going to reimburse 100% of the cost of regional transportation for students that go to those schools. Now, in my time in the legislature, we've never hit 100%, but we've been working steadily to build that number to get closer to 100%. And this was something I was concerned might get cut in this year's budget. I am really pleased that we were able to hold the level of reimbursement at 85%. And so that is a good level of reimbursement. Obviously, I want to get to 100%. Every year I try to do that, but this was not the year to be able to do it. But we were able to get to a good level of reimbursement. So those are a couple of the overarching things, Heather, that I think are important about this budget. And one more thing, and I don't want to get into too many details because I don't want to make this a conversation that might stretch people's attention span. But the last thing I would mention is the stabilization fund is really important. And we've worked hard to put about $3.5 billion into it over the last several years. In fact, since Governor Baker took office, the amount has really increased substantially. It's nearly tripled. And so we want to be careful about spending that money, but we know we need to because this kind of a year is what stabilization funds are meant for. And so we draw in our budget about $1.5 billion, which is about a 40% draw, but we still leave a significant amount of money in that stabilization fund because about $2 billion, because we know that the pandemic is not going away anytime soon. We certainly hope it will. But fiscal year 2022, which we begin planning for in January, by the way, is going to be also a very difficult year. So we keep a very substantial amount of money in the stabilization fund. Now, when it comes to amendments, we all have our different areas that we try to focus on. And one of the roles that I play as minority leader is filing amendments that are of interest to the governor, filing amendments that have a statewide impact because our party in our caucus is trying to do things that we think are good for the statewide agenda. And then we also do things that are important to each of us as individuals. So a couple that are really important to me that we're able to pass, I'm very pleased to tell you about. So the first one actually comes from a suggestion from Rockport School Superintendent Rob Lebo.
One of our favorites.
He is an incredible educator and an incredible administrator. And he had written to me and to Representative Ferranti right before the budget debate began. And he said one of the gaps in state support for local school districts are assessment tools so that school districts can determine what the degree of risk and conversely what the degree of safety might be relative to COVID-19 in terms of keeping the schools open or whatever hybrid model they might want to use. And he said there's a real deficiency in having the availability of fact-based, evidence-based tools. And that really resonated with me. So I put together an amendment that would require the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, working with the Department of Public Health, to come up with those tools and to provide them to school districts. And that amendment passed unanimously.
That's great.
And so for me, it's a great example of how someone in local government, in a local school district, can work with someone at the state level and really make a difference. And so thanks to Superintendent Lebo, we now have that amendment. Hopefully we'll be able to hold it in conference, and that will help every school district in the state.
That's great.
Second one that I think is particularly important relates to personal protective equipment, the so-called PPE that we hear about so much. And you may recall from earlier conversations that we had that at the beginning of this public health emergency, my office was charged on the part of the Senate with helping to find PPE and make sure it get distributed appropriately where it was needed and fairly and equitably. And that was a really intense task. And as pleased as we were to do it and to work with the administration and the COVID command center, we really want to have a more systemic approach in the future so that we don't have to go back to the days of really troubleshooting, every day getting up in the morning and trying to find more PPE and not knowing if we could get it. So I offered a comprehensive amendment that will require Department of Public Health to come up with a tracking system so that we know what providers have for PPE. It would require them to project what we're going to need. It would also catalog interruptions in supply chain. So if a particular supplier has not been reliable, we want everyone to know that. And it would also authorize Department of Public Health to do bulk purchase and stockpiling if it was needed. Now, it may not be needed, but if it looks like we need it, the authorization would be there. And I am very pleased that that amendment passed unanimously as well. So a couple of important things that I think will be very helpful to us now and in the future.
Anything else you want to leave us with going into the holiday week?
Well, I just would reiterate that Representative Ferranti, Representative Hill, and I are really pleased with the working relationship we have with all of our local officials. And we talk with them on a regular basis. We work with them consistently. It's not just once a year when we're doing the budget. And it certainly pays dividends during a time when we're doing the budget. And it's something that we feel particularly proud of in terms of the bipartisan nature of it and the collaborative nature of it. Now, when it comes to Thanksgiving, a couple of things. One, I think we've all heard by now that it's going to be very important that we pay attention to social distancing during the holiday. And as much as we'd like to be all together physically, this year we need to think about who's going to be around the table. And we need to make sure that we keep our distances, that we don't gather with large groups, and that we use electronic media the way that you and I are right now to maybe compensate from the separation that we're going to feel in this particular holiday. But I would say, given that, it's important to remember the folks that may not be able to be at the table with us this year, particularly because they may not be part of our household and they may be a senior. There may be folks out there that we should think about just making a call to on Thanksgiving Day and wishing them a happy Thanksgiving, letting them know we're thinking about them, and just making sure that even though we can't be together physically, we can still be together in spirit. And that's a really important thing for all of us as human beings.
It's a really nice message. So thank you so much, and happy Thanksgiving to you and whoever will be at your table this year.